So this lady, and she is a lady, not a man, is still out in the waiting room and she needs help. And we haven't quite worked out what help means. At least I haven't worked it out fully. At least, yeah, when Olaf asked me the question he asked just at the end of the last lecture, I was hinting at roughly I don't know what to do when a patient walks into a room, but my view is that the key thing is what we do. And I don't have any recipe for what we do. Okay. So let me take you to the next slide. What I forgot to mention early on was that I won't be reading out these slides to you. I'm depending on you to read out the material that's on them. This is Walter Hess, who won the Nobel Prize for Medicine. Oops, we need some muting, I guess. Okay, this is Walter Hess, who won the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 1949. And this was one of the men who trained up the people who created medicine as we know it now. People like Arvid Carlsson, who discovered the SSRIs, and Friedrich Sulzer, who was one of the big names in the psychopharmacology field also. And Sulzer said that in his classes, Hess would often say to students, it isn't about the serotonin levels or the number of cells doing this, that, or the other, or whatever. The key thing is, why do you fall in love with a girl? Now, what this tells you, first of all, is that the people who created medicine as we know it now were mostly male, which may reflect why there's such a great emphasis on efficacy rather than safety. But the other point he's making is that it's not about cells or serotonin levels. It's about what are we doing? Why are we doing what we're doing? All of our cells and neurotransmitters are geared towards that. They don't have their own life. They're part of our life. And what we need, though, is to change this Hess quote for something that's more appropriate for now, at least for the talk I'm giving you now, but I think more appropriate for now generally. And it's something like, but maybe one of you can find better words than I can. Do you think studying RCT data will tell you whether to enter a relationship with the person out in the waiting room or not? What are RCT data going to tell us about this? Now, you've seen this quote before, and this is Tony Hill again saying, RCTs can be good to evaluate one thing a drug does, not evaluate a drug, just one thing it does. And this is whether it works for whatever we want to use it for, okay? But in Hill's day, we're talking about antibiotics, and when they work, they save lives and they get people back to their employment. And if drugs save lives and get people back to their jobs, you can run a health service for free on that basis. It's going to pay for itself. If they don't work and maybe take people away from work, well, actually a health service could bankrupt a country. And the problem with antidepressants is, well, did they save lives in the trials we did? The answer is no. In all of the SSRI trials put together, more people died taking an SSRI than died taking placebo. And there's no evidence that they get people back to work. So what's going on here? And one of the things that's going on is that the word work is tricky. For most of the drugs we're using these days to lower your lipids, lower your blood sugar, thicken up your bones, increase your peak flow rates, we're looking at surrogate outcomes. We're not looking at whether we save lives or a hard outcome. In the case of behavior, we're using rating scales. These are surrogate outcomes. They're not hard outcomes. And the man who created the most famous rating scale of all, you see him here, was Max Hamilton, who created the Hamilton rating scale for depression, the HAM-D. And he was, there's a few things about this. One is he was aware that, a lot of the items on this, such as sleep and libido and things like this, could be side effects of the drugs rather than the illness. And that the interview needed to be a sensitive interview that took this into account, or the the results were going to be meaningless. And most of the results on most of the rating scales we use in mental health, at least, are meaningless for this reason. What Hamilton saw was that what he was hoping to do was to create an aid to the interview we have. But he was aware that essentially it becomes a checklist. These are the questions to ask. And very aware as well that this is going to standardize our interviews with our patients. And that may be good or bad, as the next slide shows you. From a company point of view there, and from the point of view of the managers of health services, interviews on rating scales and measures of your lipid levels and sugars and things like that are great. This is what they want. The companies want it because they know when you measure anything on a rating scale or whatever, as opposed to just do an interview with a person, it's going to lead to a use of one of their drugs. Rating scales and surrogate outcomes generally are all about, well, they aren't about helping us to live the life that we want to live. In what they used to call medicine, when we got ill, we brought a problem to the doctor. Now, medicine is much more a health service where they reach out to us and ask us to come in to be screened for our cholesterol levels or our peak flow rates or whatever, and give us problems we never knew we had. The situation is a bit like they don't want you to be a gourmet chef in what really is becoming a fast food outlet. You know, there's no place for a gourmet chef, but someone who can sit there with a patient and maybe say nothing and just get a hunch about what the right thing to ask might be in order to help this person live the life they want to live, not the one that pharmaceutical companies want them to live, which involves taking their pills. And, we can see in medicine today that things have got to a crazy extent. And the cartoon on the left gives you an example of just how crazy they've got. We're commodifying the relationships between people rather than relating. The man here with the checklist is not relating to the woman who's in an awful state. The Greeks spotted the problem 2,000 years ago in the story of King Midas, who said, wouldn't it be great if things I touched turned to gold? And he finds out that when this happens, when things turn to gold, that he ends up in a world where he can eat and drink nothing. And we're at real risk of producing the same kind of problem now, the way we're doing medicine. So let me change gears and introduce you to this book, which is a thriller. It's fiction, but it's truer than most books you can read about medicine. What you see here on the cover is a medical ghostwriter having a crisis of conscience about what she's doing. She knows people are ending up dead as a result of what she's doing. So what's she going to do about it? And if you read the book and find out what she does about it and how it all turns out, well, I have to tell you, it's truer to life than you might expect. You read this and figure, well, this is just fiction, it can't be real. What happens is very real, okay? So,
David, sorry, can you maybe just explain for everyone, in case someone doesn't know what a ghostwriter is?
Okay, I'm just about to explain it now, Andre, okay? So, I've just been asked to explain what ghostwriting is, and let me explain it. In the 1970s, pharmaceutical companies who used to write up the results of the clinical trials they did, usually in-house, outsourced that job to medical writing companies. And the next two lectures are this lecture is going to tell you a lot about medical writing. This is about medical writing, or ghostwriting, okay? The other thing they outsourced were clinical trials. And they outsourced those to contract research organizations, which is now a $40 billion business. And these are the companies that run trials on drugs in Asia and Africa and places like that. rather than in hospitals in Sweden or the United States. If it's run in the United States, they'll take patients from jails and foster homes and things like this. It's not, it's a business where the patients don't always exist, but companies are contracted to the pharmaceutical industry to get as many patients into the trials as quickly as possible. And the pharmaceutical company has plausible deniability because they're not running the trial. If something awful happens, well, it was a different company running this trial. And in the same way, the medical writing business, it's ghostwriters writing it. In the case of drug development, that's outsourced as well since the 1980s, and public relations is outsourced since the year 2000, and you're going to hear more about that. But what I want you to look at here is under the word status on this slide, you'll see this comes from a brochure prepared for Pfizer by one of these medical writing companies who are looking at all the articles being produced on Pfizer's SSRI, Zoloft. And there are articles on Zoloft being given for depression, Zoloft being given for anxiety, Zoloft being given to old people, Zoloft being given to young people, Zoloft being given for ingrown toenails and for everything. And this is the page on Zoloft for PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. You see that under the heading status there have been 2 trials done. Actually, there were 4 overall. And in these 4 trials, Zoloft did not work. But there's 2 trials here that are being talked about, and the papers on those 2 trials have been written, and they're going to go to the very best journals in the field, like the New England Journal of Medicine, whom we know are not going to ask about the data, and did the data really show what you're claiming it showed. And over on the left, you see author TBD. TBD means to be determined. The paper has been written. The names that are going to go on the authorship line haven't been decided yet. And basically, it's down to Pfizer's marketing department to figure out who they think are going to be the names that are most likely to sell the most Zoloft. They may have had nothing to do with the research. When the research is done in Asia, it'll be US names on the authorship line, and they will never have seen any of these patients. So this is what ghostwriting is about. By the end of this lecture, you're going to know a lot about ghostwriting. But let me move on to the next slide, which is, I've got stuck. This is not moving. There we go. Right. Okay. Evidence-based medicine comes on stream in the 1990s. And here's one of the early adverts for telling people what it was. And we'd been doing at that stage a lot of controlled trials, and people figured, well, we can add it all up to find out what the evidence really says and put that into guidelines, which will help doctors work out what the best thing to do is. Now, I have written to the people who are responsible for producing the NICE guidelines in the United Kingdom, which was set up by the government and claims to be completely independent of the pharmaceutical industry. I've written to regulators like FDA in the States, or EMA in Europe, or MHRA in the UK. I've written to the major journals like the New England Journal of Medicine or the BMJ. I've written to politicians. I've written to virtually everyone, saying, look, we have a problem here. Things like the NICE guidelines are based on, well, they concern drugs. They're based on ghost-written articles, and there's no access to the trial data. What do I mean by ghost-written? It's like the PTSD articles you've just seen, which is they're not written by the people they appear to be written by. They're written by medical writers whose names are not on the authorship line, and their job is to hype the drug and hide the hazards. So guidelines based on this can't be awfully reliable, can they? And NICE and regulators and journals all agree. I'm right. No one has said that what I've just said to you is wrong. They clutch at an escape clause that I give them, which is, it's not your job to police the medical literature, is it? And they say, no, it's not our job to police the medical literature. So the question is, I guess, whose job is it to police the medical literature? Now, in the transition from in the transition from medicine as it used to be to what we have now, there are a few key dates. And one of the key dates is September 20th, 1991. So almost 30 years ago. Next week will be the 30th anniversary of this key date. And what had happened, well, on that day, the FDA convened a meeting to decide whether we should put warnings on antidepressants to say that Prozac, for instance, can cause people to commit suicide. In the previous year, there have been a number of reports, old-style medical reports. I gave Prozac to a bunch of patients that became suicidal. We took the drug away, the problem cleared up. We gave people the drug again, the problem came back, which is solid evidence that Prozac can make some people become suicidal. Lilly, the company that made Prozac, responded by saying, well, these are very sad cases, but when we analyze our clinical trial data, there's no evidence there that Prozac does cause people to commit suicide. And this was, when the FDA had the meeting, this was Lilly's argument, and they presented the data, which was published in the BMJ, and the article appeared on exactly the same day. Now, the article in the BMJ at the time were the journal who were most pro-evidence-based medicine. And they were thrilled to see a pharmaceutical company apparently embracing evidence-based medicine. So this is why they were keen on it. If you looked closely at the paper, there were more suicidal events on Prozac than on placebo in the trials Lilly put into the paper, but they said these are not statistically significant. And BMJ and everybody rolled over and said, yeah, that's fine. This means the problem doesn't exist. They didn't read the paper closely because in a footnote, Lilly make it clear that actually they've done something to the data, which means in actual fact that the number of suicidal acts on Prozac was statistically significant compared to placebo. This was missed by almost everyone at the time. Lilly's defense was that the plural of anecdote, these are the reports from doctors, is not data. It was also, the problem is the disease, not the drug. And the third was, which are you going to believe? This was to the media, which are you going to believe? Are you going to believe the anecdotes, or are you going to believe the science? FDA decided not to warn, even though they were sitting on data for Zoloft and Paxil, which nobody knew anything about at that point, which showed the same thing, which was that these drugs were very weak and that they also had an increased rate of people going on to become suicidal. And if you added the data for all three drugs together, that actually there was a terribly convincing case that these drugs could make people become suicidal. So on that day, journals changed. All of a sudden, journals like the BMJ weren't prepared to take reports, which are the heart of medicine beforehand. Doctors like you reporting, this is what you've seen in the patient that you've just been seeing. Because if it was a hazard that you'd seen, the lawyers for the journal would say we might get sued by the companies. The rules about how to decide if a drug has caused a problem or not seem to have changed. We don't know where we stand. And of course, we're going to make a lot more money if you just publish RCTs and meta-analyses of RCTs. Up till then, most doctors in the UK had been getting free drugs bulletins regularly every month, which took a rounded view of the drugs. It talked about the good things and the bad things. Now, we didn't get those anymore. We got guidelines which only talk about the benefits. They don't talk about the hazards. The harms vanished. Now, if the harm your patient is reporting, like I've lost libido or I've become suicidal on a drug, if they vanish from the evidence base and your patient walks in and talks about it, you're not going to see or hear it. And if you don't see or hear it, the patient, in a sense, vanishes. And if the patient vanishes, the problem is you're at risk of vanishing too, because the people who run our health service companies these days, the managers of these companies, are not going to see an expert like you managing toxicity, a very tricky thing which requires you to be paid more than the average in healthcare, they're going to be seeing drugs that work wonderfully well and are free of harms. And, well, they could be given by cheaper prescribers, couldn't they? By nurses, by pharmacists. Do we need expensive prescribers? So let's say you do see and hear the patient and pay heed to them and they talk about becoming suicidal on the drug, and you tease it out with them and they're able to tell you things to convince you this drug does seem to cause the problem. Maybe if you hold the drug, the problem clears up, which makes it even stronger. And the evidence base doesn't say that these drugs can cause this problem. Like, for instance, montelukast for asthma can cause people to become suicidal. And the evidence base doesn't, or until recently, didn't talk about this at all. If you look at the evidence base and there's no sign of it there, I mean, let me go back one step. The scientific approach to your patient is to examine and cross-examine them. Medicine is judicial. It's not engineering. It's judicial, trying to work out what has happened. If after you've done that scientific job and figured the drug has caused the problem, the next scientific job is to explain why there's a mismatch between the evidence and what the patient seems to be saying. And if you dig into the SSRIs and antidepressants story to find out why there's a mismatch, what you find is true for all drugs and all problems, which is you find that the entire medical literature on patent drugs is ghost-written. It's written by medical writers. You find there is no access to the clinical trial data. Not even the regulator, FDA, for instance, have seen or have the clinical trial data. And I don't mean the people, I mean the figures. They absolutely don't have access to the people. When you do get access to the full figures from the trials that FDA haven't seen, and maybe even get access to the people, you find that what has happened to the people in the trial matches what's happening in the patient right in front of you. There is not a conflict between what happened in the trials and your patients. There's a conflict between the medical literature and your patient. But you appear to be up against the science. So here's one of the other key dates in the transition from what used to be medicine to whatever it is we have now. And this is World Mental Health Day 2002, October 10th. And on the front cover of Newsweek, you see what you see here, which is 3 million teenagers in the United States are depressed. They are going to go on to a life of drug abuse and alcoholism and divorce and job loss and career failure and suicide because of this. But the US cavalry is just around the corner and they're going to ride in and save everything. Prozac has been approved to treat teenagers who are depressed, and Paxil has been approved as well. Newsweek know this. Paxil was approved on the same day that this comes out, and Zoloft's just about to be approved. Okay, so a year beforehand, Study 329 has been published, and this is it here. It's in the article with the highest impact factor in child psychiatry. It's got an authorship line to die for. There's 22 people here. These are some of the biggest names in the field. When people like this say that this drug works well and is safe, it's a bit like reading the Bible. You have got to believe it. The author of the paper is not on the authorship line. The author of the paper was a woman called Sally Layton, and her name is not here. Study 329 began in 1994. The first patient went into it, and it completed in early 1998. Later that year, GlaxoSmithKline, and you see the document here, decided that Study 329 was negative for paroxetine. It didn't work. But if you see at the bottom, it says, we'll take the positive data from the study and publish that. And that's the Keller et al. Paper that you've just seen in the previous slide. This is a 6-page document. I'm just showing you one bit, but I will tell you at the end exactly where you can get the whole document. Now, On the basis of this document, New York State took a fraud action against GlaxoSmithKline in 2004, and GlaxoSmithKline agreed to resolve the action, pay money, and do what New York State asked it to do, which was to put the clinical trial data from the trials for kids and their other trials up on the web, up on the company's website. And I'm going to tell you about this now. But before I do, I said New York State took a fraud action. And the point behind a fraud action is not that a company has done something wrong. You've got to be able to prove that the company intended to do something wrong. And that's what the previous document proved. GlaxoSmithKline disowned the document, but this is part of a letter that FDA wrote to GlaxoSmithKline on October the 10th, World Mental Health Day 2002, saying this is the approvable letter agreeing to let Paxil be marketed for teenagers who are depressed. But FDA is saying to GSK, and the big print is trying to make the small print easier to read, and it's we agree with you. You've told us that study 329 and these other two studies are negative. We agree with you. They are negative studies. And we also agree with you when you said it would not be useful to describe these trials in the labeling of the drug. It's very hard to explain why FDA would say something like this to a company, other than if GlaxoSmithKline had said to them, well, look, we published 329 as a positive study. If you mention in the label of the drug that it's negative, we might be sued for fraud. As you've seen, they were sued for fraud. Now, study 329 and some of the other studies GlaxoSmithKline put up on the web as a result of that led the Department of Justice in the United States to take its own legal action against GlaxoSmithKline, which was resolved in 2012 for $3 billion, which was then the biggest resolution of a corporate case like this in corporate history. This is a news item in the BMJ reporting that, and you here in the photograph, you see Andrew Whitty, the CEO of GlaxoSmithKline. And here you see him again on the front cover of the BMJ 4 months later, where he's the candidate of hope. He's the Obama-like figure. He's the savior of the world, particularly the pharmaceutical industry. This is great, wonderful, and marvelous. He's wonderful, and GSK are wonderful. Why? Well, GSK have agreed to join a thing called, which has just been set up, called All Trials. It was set up 3 months before this. It was set up by a group called Sense About Science, who are an outsourced public relations arm for the pharmaceutical industry. The BMJ were involved. Lots of people who are part of the evidence-based medicine movement, totally independent of the pharmaceutical industry, were involved. Bioethics people who hate the pharmaceutical industry donated money to All Trials, who raised a huge amount of money. Everybody thought that when they heard All Trials, they heard all data. We're getting access to pharmaceutical company clinical trial data, and this can only be a good thing. Well, you weren't. The formula that GSK, who had joined All Trials and who probably were the brains behind All Trials, had set up was that people like Andre Marks, you heard Andre ask earlier, how do I get access to this healthy volunteer data? Well, people like Andre Marks who want access to the data, they have to have a responsible plan for what they're going to do with the data. It has to be taken through an independent panel, and they have to agree to recognize commercial confidentiality and clinical confidentiality too. So this is not all data. All data came on stream later that year in 2013. And the man responsible for it was Peter Doshi, who's one of the most remarkable people I know. And he's written this article, which appeared in the BMJ, on restoring invisible and abandoned trials. What does that mean? Well, it was all about, in the case of some trials we know which haven't ever been published, are trials which have maybe been misreported, like study 329, If there's access to a sufficient amount of data, people can re-author them and see if they can restore the trial to what it should have looked like in the first instance. When GlaxoSmithKline put their reports up on the web, they put up what are called company study reports. This is the internal document about what the trials showed. And in the case of the Study 329 trial, it had appendices A to H. Peter noticed that these were missing. So he got New York State to get GSK to post the appendices. And GSK agreed to post appendices A to G, but not H. Now, some of us, on the basis of the company study report and appendices A to G, were able to get together as a team and see, could we write up what this study should have really looked like? The original Keller paper you see here is a 10.5-page paper. GSK's company study report was over 800 pages. So you see that here. The appendices for the company study report came to over 5,000 pages. So if you add them in, you see them here. But there was no Appendix H. Now, we applied to GSK for a Appendix H on a few occasions and were told no. And then we applied again, and for reasons that I'm not clear of, perhaps because there's 100,000 people in GSK, many of them very good people, and they've all got a right and a left hand. One person's left hand didn't know what a different person's right hand was doing, and we ended up with access to Appendix H, which is 77,000 pages long. Okay, now when I said we ended up with access, I don't mean we could print it off or we could download it. We couldn't. We could look at Appendix H through a triple lock portal. You had to put passwords into 3 different portals to get anywhere near it. And even after you did that, when you were looking at it through the portal, the system chucked you off regularly. So it took half a year before we were really confident about what we were seeing and could fully write up the paper and send it in to the BMJ, who had been interested in publishing this paper. Now, if you look at the BMJ website, they say, we'll usually let you know within 2 or 3 weeks whether we're going to accept your paper or not. And, it'll be published about 8 weeks later. Well, over a year later, we hadn't been published. Usually when an article goes into BMJ for review, there's 2 reviewers. We had 7. Usually it's just reviewed once. Our paper was reviewed 7 times, okay? It was finally published in September of 2015. And here's the front cover of the BMJ. And you won't be awfully surprised to know that when we looked at the data Keller et al. Had published saying that this drug works wonderfully well, we couldn't find that. No matter what way you tortured the data, you couldn't show paroxetine worked compared to placebo. Now, I'm showing you 8 weeks of data here. There was also a 26-week continuation phase, which had never been published. And the other thing that isn't here is the withdrawal effects, which weren't ever published. The efficacy data, in a sense, you knew beforehand because I told you that this drug didn't work. So that's not a surprising slide. The more interesting aspect of the paper is about the adverse events. And the paper lists a lot of the tricks that companies use to hide these adverse events. And it's also about authorship, as I'm going to tell you now in a second. Among the things that they did was they failed to transcribe all events from Appendix H over to Appendix D, which is where the adverse events were. The other thing was they filtered adverse events through statistical techniques of one sort or the other to make them disappear. You could also have a patient become agitated on paroxetine, and they might get coded under anxiety or hyperkinesis or akathisia or agitation or nervousness or restlessness. So a problem that might be quite big could somehow vanish into smaller pots. But the key things, well, actually, before I go on to that, two other quick things was, one is the drug withdrawal phase went completely missing. Another thing was some of the patients, this is the second point from the bottom, some of the patients on placebo were taking SSRIs. Well, how does this happen? Well, they were taking antihistamines, and some of you will know that a lot of the antihistamines are also potent serotonin reuptake inhibitors. You can become suicidal on them. So this is another issue which helped hide the problems. But the two things I want to tell you about in particular were they coded adverse events and they grouped adverse events. And let me take you to the next slide, which is we use the commonest coding dictionary that is in use called MEDRA. GSK used a coding dictionary that nobody had ever heard of before, no one knew about except GSK. And this allowed them legally to code suicidal events as emotional lability. Now, nobody reading the Keller paper who see this term, which appears a lot on the paper, would have any idea that actually what they're talking about is something terribly serious. It's children becoming suicidal or aggressive or whatever. So the coding dictionary is the coding act is the first act of authorship. When you read a paper, it'll have a methods section, and most of us skip over the methods section because it's a bit tedious. But the methods section of a controlled trial never contains anything about coding, and it never contains anything about grouping the drugs, which is part of coding. What do I mean by grouping? Well, headache was close to the commonest adverse event that happened in this trial, and dizziness was one of the other awfully common ones. And if you group headaches and dizziness along with behavioral events under a neurological heading, then all of a sudden, paroxetine and imipramine, which caused a lot of dizziness, particularly given to children in a 300 milligram dose, and placebo can look roughly the same. The signal about behavioral events vanishes. So how you group things can be crucially important. Once you've coded adverse events and once you've grouped them, you've almost written the paper. But there's nothing ever in any of the randomized controlled trial literature that you read that tells you anything about just what went on or gives you any chance to go in and reorganize the groups, which would be totally legitimate. When we reauthored the paper, we've put the groups up on a website and said anyone, including GlaxoSmithKline, is welcome to come in and reorder the groups or tell us why a particular event should be coded differently to the way we've coded it. When you do this, you begin to appreciate that the data, so-called, that comes out of a controlled trial is not biblical. It's not fixed in stone. It is the kind of stuff where it's legitimate to go and change and say, I can see a different way to do it, which may be better. Like any good science, when you get access to this kind of material, you realize that randomized controlled trials open up questions rather than close them down. Rather than telling doctors this worked and there were no problems and you should give this drug, randomized controlled trials raise a lot of questions about the drug and treatment or whatever. But that's not the way the pharmaceutical company or health service companies want you to view them. Now, the key event in the trial, apart from emotional lability, was headache. And the editor in the BMJ that was working on our paper and knocking it back and meant it was almost impossible to get published was Elizabeth Loader, whose name you see here on this book. And one of the things we became aware of was, she hated everything we were doing and said we had loads of conflicts of interest. And in particular, though, she was very concerned about any time we touched headaches. So we Googled her and found out that she's a headache expert and has worked closely with pharmaceutical companies, including GSK, and has written books about headache, which explained why she was sensitive about headaches. We also found out when we Googled it that her husband worked for Ropes and Gray. And Ropes and Gray are one of the main law firms defending GSK in the legal action the Department of Justice took against them, which cost GSK $3 billion. And Elizabeth Loader mentioned nothing about this when she was handling our paper. When we mentioned this to the BMJ suddenly said, well, we'll publish your paper after all. So the other key event was emotional liability, which, as I've said, in the Keller paper, which you see down at the bottom here, there's 5 blue dots. These are the children who became emotionally labile taking paroxetine, and almost no medical doctor reading this paper had any idea what that meant, and they said, oh, that sounds harmless. As I said, it wasn't harmless. When a fuss blew up around 2003 about children becoming suicidal on these drugs, FDA asked GlaxoSmithKline and other companies to reanalyze their data. And what you see in the middle box is GSK's reanalysis, which shows more suicidal events than the original paper had showed. But they said it's not a problem because these are not statistically significant. When we reanalyze the data, you see in the top box, there's lots more dots than there were before, and these are statistically significant. But we didn't even then have all of the data. I mentioned to you that there was a young man who was arrested by the police for going out in the street and waving his gun about and threatening to kill people. And this isn't him, by the way, this is just a young man. GSK managed to drop him out, and he's not one of their blue dots at all, or one of ours. They dropped him out on the basis he had an intercurrent illness. If we'd known about that when we wrote the paper, he would have been a blue dot, because this is clearly a behavioral event, an emotionally labile event. In this trial, there were 4 people dropped out of the trial for intercurrent illness, on which no reports were actually prepared. They were all taking Paxil. Now, it's probably the case that, to go back to this graph here, that we should be adding 4 more blue dots to what you see there in the top box. Now, I mentioned to you no one had ever seen the continuation phase data, and well, here it is. This has also now been published. And you see the first 8 weeks there, and then you see the 26 weeks afterward, and equally, there's no difference between placebo and active treatment during this period. I have to tell you that at the end of 8 weeks, a lot of the placebo patients dropped out, and these were patients who had recovered completely. Their scores were close to 0. If you included them, if they had stayed in the continuation phase, placebo would have probably looked better than anything else. When we had the continuation phase data, we were able to look at withdrawal. And this trial was run at a time when GlaxoSmithKline was saying, there is no problem with dependence and withdrawal on our drug. But if you look at the data from study 329, the withdrawal phase is the riskiest phase for people going on to commit a suicidal act on paroxetine. So if you want to know a lot more about study 329, if you want to have access to the data like the fraud document or the approvable letter by FDA saying we approve Paxil for use in children, ultimately, once the story came out, FDA dropped the approval. They couldn't continue with the approval of Paxil. So if you want to see all of the documents, the correspondence between us and the BMJ, which got awfully heated, the responses of the authors, the so-called authors of Study 329 when our paper got published, it's all here on study329.org. If you want a different account of what went on, which tells you who was sleeping with who and who it was who found the key documents, it's in this book called Children of the Cure. It's not as racy and pacey a thriller as Malcrest is, but it's a little bit more interesting than the average academic book. Okay. Now, we do control trials. When we do an RCT and it's negative for a drug, the expectation was that you just wouldn't use that drug anymore. If there's a bunch of RCTs negative for the drug, you really wouldn't use it. It will be a bit like giving thalidomide to people. You wouldn't really want to use it. Okay, so as you all know, Greta Thunberg's generation are very concerned about the environment and the chemicals and the pollution in the environment. So there of the trials done for depressed people of her age and teenagers generally, and people who are in their early 20s, there have been 45 trials done. We know that essentially all the trials since 1990 have been ghost-written. There was no access to the data on these drugs. When we get access to the data, there is a complete mismatch between the publications and the data. This is the greatest mismatch that we know of in medicine, but it's probably typical of all trials and all drugs that you use. Study 329 was not a bad trial. It was done in university hospitals. It was done by decent academics, nice people. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't done in jails or anything like that. But ultimately, it's industry standard. It's not atypical. It's industry standard. Ultimately, though, there are 45 trials done. All 45 are negative, including the 2 trials on Prozac, which are published as positive and led FDA to approve the drug. These are negative trials too. And Greta Thunberg's generation, you would have thought, would never have an antidepressant put in their mouth. But in fact, antidepressants are now the second most commonly taken drugs by teenage girls. This is a generation that go to the gym, eat vegetarian, and take SSRIs. Why? Well, we've lost something. It's if people have a pimple or 2 in their skin, we don't just take non-drug approaches towards acne or pimples these days. We give Roaccutane, which can cause you to commit suicide and which can wipe out your sex life forever. Young men whose hair in their late teens, early 20s, whose hair is thinning, and this is pretty grim, people don't like it, can take finasteride and that can wipe out your sex life forever and cause you to commit suicide. And we seem to be taking SSRIs. It's not for treating a mental illness. We're doing it, it seems to me, because we figure people shouldn't have to handle distress or negative emotions, and people have a feeling that that's what these drugs are going to do. And if you try and get in the way of that, people will trample over you. Doctors, the younger people and doctors generally, the idea that there's 45 negative trials of these drugs doesn't register. So this has got consequences for all of us, which I'm going to pick up in the next lecture, when the lady who's been out in the waiting room for a long time now is going to come into our office and tell us what her issue is and check and see whether we can help her. Okay, thanks.